Basically, this presentation is going to be my attempt to share some of the most important things I've learned over the last few years and shine a light on a field that I think is in complete disarray. So the presentation will be, before I get to that, I just want to provide a disclaimer. This presentation will be a critical look at psychiatry, and by the end of it you may feel the urge to categorize me as anti-psychiatry or some other word similar to that effect, and you're welcome to do so, but I'm not so much anti-psychiatry as pro-science, and I think these two things clash. So the presentation will be in three parts. First, we'll go through a brief history of psychiatry and look at its origins. Then we'll look at some facts about modern psychiatry, and then look at some ways forward. So let's begin. We can start with Benjamin Rush, who's often described as the father of American psychiatry. He published the first American psychiatry textbook in 1812, and we like to think now with advances in neuroimaging, we can look at brain activity, and we develop these theories about broken brains and chemical imbalances to explain why people have certain experiences or why they think in a certain way. But this blaming the brain phenomenon is by no means a new thing. So as Rush wrote centuries ago, the cause of madness is seated primarily in the blood vessels of the brain. So this has been going on for a long time. So I'm sure you're aware that the asylums of old were pretty terrible, and Rush promoted treatments such as bloodletting, physical restraint, and psychological terror. And during the mid-19th century, a number of physicians that presided over these asylums, they created an association called the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which later became the American Psychiatric Association. Also of note during this time, Emil Kraepelin published his first psychiatry textbook in 1883, and he's most famous for inventing dementia praecox, which later became schizophrenia. So around the late 19th century, there were about 150 public and private mental hospitals managing over 40,000 individuals. However, by the end of the 19th century, those considered mentally ill were still a very small percentage of the population relative to today, as we'll discuss later. So summarizing this period, Kirk, Gamori, and Cohen wrote that by the start of the 20th century, a barely nascent psychiatric profession whose task centered entirely on the management of insane asylums had won the argument that good science demanded the institutional control of madness via state mental hospitals. Now, in World War I, the Selective Service Act was passed, which created a division which was responsible for evaluating and rejecting military recruits diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. And in World War I, there was over 100,000 individuals excluded or discharged for various neuropsychiatric disorders. By the end of World War II, this was almost 2 million of 36 million men that were classified for military service. And based on General Hershey's testimony at the end of World War II, this led to the passing of the National Mental Health Act of 1946, which created the National Institute of Mental Health, which exists today. So the way they screened these people out of the military was not particularly scientific at all. So the diagnosis was made by understaffed and poorly trained people. The tools lacked any reliability. The interviews were ridiculously short, like 2 minutes long. And this was at the height of the eugenics movement, and there was a lot of racism and homophobia. And often these diagnoses were just an excuse to exclude people that were considered inferior. So as one historian summarized, the military feared in particular that the inadvertent recruitment of homosexual males would have a devastating effect on the armed forces and supported many measures that might exclude them. Screening was arbitrary and capricious, racial and ethnic considerations intruded in the process, and personality tests were biased and unreliable. Now, in the mid-20th century, this also was when the DSM was created, and the most impactful version of the DSM was the DSM-3 in 1980. And this really was the time when psychiatry really gained the ascendancy and became the main arbiter of the people that really defined what was considered abnormal. Also during this time was the rise of psychiatry drugs, the first being chlorpromazine in 1954, and many other psychiatry drugs followed. And these drugs, based on their assumed effectiveness, which has been debunked many times, it turns out that the evidence in support of the efficacy of the drugs was not very good at all. So the assumed effectiveness of these drugs inspired theories that people who were diagnosed with depression or schizophrenia had a lack of various neurotransmitters in the brain, and these drugs were correcting those deficiencies. So all of these things, the federal focus on mental health issues, the creation of the DSM, the rise of psychiatric drugs, and these biomedical theories all coalesced to allow psychiatry to become the dominant framework. And summarizing this period, I'd just like to share an excerpt from a paper by Baumeister and colleagues which give a good summary of these events. So they write, the advent of the monoamine hypothesis was a historically significant event. Psychiatry has long been considered the stepchild of medicine. The reasons for this are manifold, but one important factor was the gravitation of psychiatry in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in the US, toward psychosocial explanations, for example, the schizophrenic mother, and therapies, for example, psychoanalysis. To many physicians, serious mental illness is, on its face, an organic disease, and psychosocial approaches are not only wrong-headed, they're outside of the realm of medicine, if not science. Moreover, prior to the psychopharmacology revolution of the 1950s and 60s, psychiatry had a bad reputation due to the use of crude, ineffective, and sometimes barbaric treatments, for example, electrical brain stimulation. The biochemical theories of mental disorders and the related drug therapies that evolved during the 50s and 60s helped to establish psychiatry as a, quote, real medical discipline, and enhanced its prestige within the medical community and the public at large. Schildkraut's norepinephrine hypothesis was so influential, in part because it supported the development of a paradigm shift in psychiatry away from the psychoanalytic explanations and archaic somatic treatments toward biochemical explanations and pharmacotherapy for mental disorders. So that's just a brief summary of the history. So now we'll move on to modern psychiatry and try to answer the question, is it really fair to call psychiatry a, quote, real medical discipline? So to try to answer this question, I'm going to present 12 facts about modern psychiatry that hope to allow us to be able to answer this question. So to begin, there are no objective tests in psychiatry, none whatsoever. To quote the British Psychological Society, there is no objective biological test such as a blood test or scan for diagnosing mental illness. What's more, rather than being developed and validated through a scientific process of pattern identification informed by appropriate evidence-based theory, psychiatric disorders and the criteria used to diagnose them are voted into existence by committees informed by theories which lack empirical support. If you'd like to know more on this, James Davies has a great paper about the creation of the DSM-3 and how it was basically a group of experts just deciding what they thought was normal and abnormal. Now, if the lack of objectivity wasn't bad enough, people have also criticized the reliability of the diagnoses and claimed that they're very subjective and not particularly reliable. And this is true. Based on the DSM-5 criteria, they conducted these trials to try to establish the reliability of the diagnosis. And they used something called a kappa statistic, which basically reflects the interrelated reliability of a diagnosis. So they go from -1 to 1, and the closer to 1, the more unanimous the verdicts, the more clinicians can agree on what constitutes a particular disorder. Now, schizophrenia gained a kappa score of 0.46. For major depression, it's 0.28, and for general anxiety disorder, it's 0.2. So the reliability is very poor. But even if they were all 1.0, I would argue that it doesn't really matter, because reliability in psychiatry is a red herring. And to illustrate what I mean by this, I'd just like to ask for a bit of audience participation. Don't worry, though, it's very easy. I'm just going to show you some pictures. I'd just like to tell me what they are. What's this? Unicorn. I agree. What's this? I agree. Last one. Unicorn? I agree. By the way, this one my favorite. So does the fact that we can agree that these are all unicorns make them real? No. The same logic applies to psychiatry. A belief, an agreement about what you label something doesn't make anything real. Without an underlying identification of a disease, you're just labeling. That's all you're doing. Now, chemical imbalance. So as I mentioned earlier, these psychiatric drugs stimulated the rise of these theories of deficiencies in neurochemicals, and the reason that they really became so well known is partly due to Big Pharma's immense marketing campaigns. However, the science supporting them is basically non-existent. It's very poor. So as Lacasse and Leo stated in 2005, contemporary neuroscience research has failed to confirm any serotonergic lesion in any mental disorder and has in fact provided significant counter-evidence to the explanation of a simple neurotransmitter deficiency. The BPS also stated high-profile claims for a causal imbalance of neurotransmitters such as serotonin remain unproven. There is no consistent pattern relating serotonin or any of the other monoamines to the experiences associated with the diagnosis of depression. And it's illogical to claim that you have an imbalance because no one actually knows what a balance of serotonin should be or any other neurotransmitter. Like if you ask them, well, how many How much serotonin should be in my brain at any one time? No one can tell you. What's more than that, the BPS also stated that in relation to the great majority of psychiatric diagnoses, including those experiences and behaviors labeled as schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, personality disorders, and eating disorders, there's no consistent associations with any biological pathology or impairment, and no biomarkers have been identified. That leads me on to genes. You've probably seen headlines like these claiming that mental illness genes have been found. And in the DSM-5 regarding schizophrenia, it says that there is a strong contribution for genetic factors in determining risk for schizophrenia, with a number of risk alleles each contributing a small proportion to the total population variance. Now, interestingly, in the same year that the DSM-5 was published, 2013, the task force chair of the DSM, David Kupfer, published a press release, an APA press release, in which he admitted that in the future we hope to be able to identify disorders using biological and genetic markers. Yet, since the 1970s, they've been able to do this, and they're still waiting. So, which is it? Have they found the genes or not? The reality is that they haven't, or rather they found them, but then they lost them. So, as the chair of the DSM-4 task force stated, billions of research dollars have failed to produce convincing evidence that any mental disorder is a discrete disease entity with a unitary cause. Dozens of different candidate genes have been found, but in the follow-up studies, they each turned out to be fool's gold. So, the BPS also stated that no major genes with significant effect have been identified for any functional diagnosis. And based on these repeated failures to replicate these supposed discoveries, psychologist Jay Joseph argues that all gene discovery claims in psychiatry should be assumed to be false positive associations between genes and disorders until proven otherwise. So for me, when I hear about these headlines, unless there's replication, I just ignore it. But even if they were able to replicate, there's other problems claiming that a gene causes a particular disorder. I won't get into now. Now, antidepressants. I think it's 1 in 8 in the US now are consuming these drugs, but the evidence suggests they don't really work. So based on a review by Irving Kirsch in 2014, he concluded that antidepressants are supposed to work by fixing a chemical imbalance, specifically a lack of serotonin in the brain. Indeed, the supposed effectiveness is the primary evidence for the chemical imbalance theory, but analyses of the published data and the unpublished data that were hidden by drug companies reveals that most, if not all, of the benefits are due to the placebo effect. Some antidepressants increase serotonin levels, some decrease it, and some have no effect at all on serotonin. Nevertheless, they all show the same therapeutic benefit. Even the small statistical difference between antidepressants and placebos may be enhanced placebo effect due to the fact that most patients and doctors in clinical trials successfully break blind. The serotonin theory is as close as any theory in the history of science to having been proved wrong. Now, it's actually, first, antidepressant is not a scientific term, it's just a marketing term that, just like antipsychotic that Big Pharma created. But it's actually misleading to say that they're just placebos, because placebos don't cause all these harmful side effects. And it's also, I don't like using the word side effects either, because it implies that the drugs actually have a curative effect, which they don't, because there's no actual physical pathology that's been identified in people diagnosed with things like depression. So there's nothing for the drugs to actually correct. So the effects are just, the side effects are really just the effects, which include sexual dysfunction, brain abnormalities, suicide, violence, mortality, risks to newborns. A lot of women, pregnant women, are taking these drugs. Moving on, Prozac should never have been approved. So I'm sure you're aware that, particularly in the US, the way in which drugs are approved is incredibly corrupt. Basically, a drug company needs to provide evidence in 2 clinical trials that their drug is significantly effective over placebo. However, there's no limit to the number of trials they can conduct. So it's basically like playing darts and trying to hit the bullseye, but you have unlimited darts. Eventually, you're going to hit the bullseye. So regarding Prozac, this was a particularly sordid affair, how this drug was approved. So as Peter Breggin summarized, when it came time to approve Prozac, the combined efforts of the drug company and the FDA could not come up with even one good study that unequivocally supported the value of Prozac in comparison to placebo. The FDA then decided to break its own rules. It gave approval to Prozac based on its marginal effectiveness when in combination with addictive, tranquilizing drugs that reduced the patient's Prozac-induced agitation, anxiety, and insomnia. In the end, Prozac was in reality approved as a combination drug. Prozac plus sedative, addictive tranquilizers such as Valium and Dalmine, but the medical profession and the public were never told. Now, most psychotropic medications aren't actually prescribed by psychiatrists. It's only about a quarter. But more interestingly, between 1996 and 2007, the proportion of visits at which antidepressants were prescribed, but no psychiatric diagnoses were noted, increased from about 60% to over 70%. So more and more people are being given these drugs without actually receiving a diagnosis. People actually prefer psychotherapy to drugs. So despite the fact that 1 in 6 adults in the US are now consuming psychiatric drugs, a meta-analysis of 34 studies found that participants were 3 times more likely to express a preference for psychological treatment relative to medication. Despite this, over a 10-year period among antidepressant users, those undergoing psychotherapies declined from about a third to a fifth. And between 2004 and 2005, only 1 in 10 psychiatrists was providing psychotherapy to all the clients. So in 2005, it was estimated that about half of Americans will be afflicted by mental illness during their lives. However, it now seems that psychiatry has successfully medicalized the everyday lives of the majority. So based on data from 5 longitudinal studies, they found that of those receiving a psychiatric diagnosis range from about 60% to over 85%, with the authors concluding that experiencing a diagnosis of a mental disorder at some point during the life course is now the norm, not the exception. This is a great example of what can happen when you don't adhere to an objective criteria when making diagnoses. You get this kind of runaway diagnostic inflation. It's pretty ridiculous to assume that 85% of the population have a brain disease. Let's talk about stigma now. So recently there's been this idea promulgated that mental illness is an illness like any other. It's no different to something like cancer or heart disease or diabetes. Both the APA and Sane Australia have made this claim. And the reason behind it, the sensible reason, is that if we tell people this, then, because nobody blames someone for having cancer, so if we compare mental illness to cancer, then that's going to reduce stigma. People will be more accepting if they believe in this way. But the research actually suggests quite the opposite. So based on a review by Reed and colleagues, found that belief in biogenetic explanations of schizophrenia is positively correlated with prejudice, fear, and desires for distance. So people that support a biological explanation for something like schizophrenia, they're actually more stigmatizing. A more recent study in 2010 compared differences in public causal attributions of schizophrenia, depression, and alcohol dependence over a 10-year period. And they found that although endorsement of biogenetic explanations grew, stigma did not increase, with the authors concluding an over-reliance on the neurobiological causes of mental illness or substance use disorders is at best ineffective, at worst potentially stigmatizing. Finally, a review of 33 studies suggests that biological conceptions of mental illness do not reduce stigma, it can actually exacerbate the problem. People in developed countries actually do worse with these supposed treatments. So in the 90s, the World Health Organization, they conducted some studies, outcome studies, with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they found that after 2 years, about 2/3 of the patients in less developed countries were doing well, compared to only 1/3 of the patients in the developed countries. And the research concluded that being in a developed country was the strongest predictor of not attaining complete remission. Now, a number of critics, including Robert Whittaker and James Davies, they note that 61% of the patients in the developed countries were on continuous antipsychotic drugs, compared to only 16% of the developed countries, meaning that better outcomes were associated with less psychiatric drug use. So these supposedly advanced scientific medical treatments are actually harming more people than they're helping. More recently, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Thomas Insel, said after spending 13 years and $20 billion, I don't think we've moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. Scandalous. If that wasn't bad enough, psychiatric drugs, Dr. Peter Gertcher argues, kill 500,000 Americans and Europeans, among those 65 and over, every single year. So these poor outcomes, the lack of objectivity in psychiatry is not going to notice by medical students. So as authors of a publication in 2011 stated, a number of people pursuing careers in psychiatry has decreased dramatically, citing research that found that from academic year 2000 to 2001 to 2007 to 2008, US training programs in psychiatry decreased and the number of graduates dropped by almost 14%. In the UK, the Royal College of Psychiatry sees recruitment into psychiatry at a crisis point, reporting that in England, psychiatrist vacancies have doubled in 4 years. And many other European nations have reported that too few medical students are entering the field. So, addressing the decades of failures of this field, the UN recently called for a revolution. They published a new report, special report in 2017, in which they stated the following. A growing research base has produced evidence indicating that the status quo, preoccupied with biomedical interventions, including psychotropic medications and non-consensual measures, is no longer defensible in the context of improving mental health. Public policies continue to neglect the importance of the preconditions of poor mental health, such as violence, disempowerment, social exclusion and isolation, and the breakdown of communities, systemic socio-economic disadvantage, and the harmful conditions at work and in schools. Reductive, biochemical approaches to treatment that do not adequately address contacts and relationships can no longer be considered compliant with the right to health. So, has psychiatry began to look in the mirror and self-reflect on these repeated failures? Unfortunately, it seems that they haven't. Based on what I've read, the explanation, the solution that psychiatrists have put forward is that people just don't understand the field, they're stigmatizing psychiatry, and we need to rebrand, we need to teach people what psychiatry is, and maybe change the name. And to illustrate this point of view, I'm going to share some excerpts from a paper, an article published in Scientific American, entitled "Maybe We Should Call Psychiatry Something Else," written by a psychiatrist called Nathaniel Morris. I think this is just a great demonstration, example of how divorced some psychiatrists are from reality. So, the author begins by saying, psychiatry, the medical specialty, focused on mental health, remains looked down upon in nearly every corner of our society. The public often doesn't regard psychiatrists as medical doctors. Many view psychiatric treatments as pseudoscience at best and harmful at worst. Even among health professionals, it's one of the least respected medical specialties. Now, I hope, given the facts I've just discussed with you, I think the public is completely justified to have this lack of respect because of these repeated failures. So, as I mentioned, the author also highlights the decline in interest in psychiatry, saying that academic papers abound with titles like "Is Psychiatry Dying?" and "Are Psychiatrists an Endangered Species?" Despite growing mental health needs nationwide, fewer medical students are applying into the field, and the number of psychiatrists in the US is falling, as I mentioned before. So he goes on to state, much of this stems from one misunderstanding what psychiatry actually is. It's the medical field where doctors incorporate neuroscience and medical research to treat patients with diagnosable mental disorders. I spend my days using evidence-based practices to care for patients, like managing alcohol withdrawal, giving medication for psychosis, or performing suicide risk assessments. Yet my friends think I'm interpreting dreams or administering Rorschach tests. Now, it may be true that gone are the days of using Rorschach tests, but the author can hardly claim that the diagnostic criteria currently used are any more scientific. Again, they're not based on any actual demonstrable physical pathologies. So I think it's just an example of a psychiatrist who doesn't actually understand his own field. So he continues, from Illinois to Ohio to Virginia, psychiatry departments have been changing their names to include scientific terms like neuroscience and behavioral health. These language shifts help psychiatrists sound more reputable. Indeed, science and evidence should be the underpinnings of our profession. But a simpler option might work even better for renaming the field mental health care. So I just wanted to underline this point because I think it's an interesting choice of words. He says science and evidence should be the underpinnings of our profession. Well, it's not. And changing the name is not going to change the underlying issues with this profession, which is built on a house of cards, basically. So the author admits that it's naive to think a name change will remove all the stigma against mental illness. We need more research to understand these diseases. We need better tests and criteria for our diagnoses. More effective medicines are needed. More spokespeople and more openness can make a difference. Psychiatry means healing of the psyche, which stems from Psyche, the Greek goddess of the soul. It's a romantic notion, but we don't treat patient souls. We treat diagnosable diseases of the brain. No, you don't. Neurologists do that. Again, this belief that they diagnose diseases of the brain. They don't. When you get a diagnosis of depression or schizophrenia, no one examines your brain. They only do this to exclude an actual medical illness. You're only given a diagnosis when they can establish that there's no medical issue. So, by definition, a psychiatric disorder is not a medical disease. So, as I mentioned, this is not a unique case of this kind of what Peter Gertrude has described as organized denial of the psychiatric profession. And a decade and a half ago, Robert Whittaker stated the same thing, so there's not been really much of a change in their thinking. He stated, there is no evidence of any budding humility in American psychiatry that might stir the introspection that would be of a necessary first step toward reform. At least in the public arena, all we usually hear about are advancements in knowledge and treatment, as if the march of progress is certain. Hubris is everywhere, and in mad science, that has always been a prescription for disaster. The day will come when people look back at our current medicines for schizophrenia, and the stories we'll tell patients about their abnormal chemistry, brain chemistry, and they will shake their heads in utter disbelief. I don't think we're there yet. So, what can be done? Well, first of all, I would advocate stop promoting misinformation. I know it's very difficult for us to fight against Big Pharma's marketing machine, but I think it's a good idea to call these people out and ask them questions like, so, show me your blood test if you have a chemical imbalance. Say things like that. And if people come to you expecting drugs based on what they've heard on the TV, and tell them that debunk Big Pharma's propaganda and make them aware of all the harmful effects of these drugs. Something else that I do personally that has been advocated by many British psychologists is I don't use this medical language. I only use it in quotations. So things like treatment, patient, cause, schizophrenia, diagnosis. I don't use these terms unless I'm using them in quotations because I refuse to use this kind of language that implies illness. When you do use this kind of language, it gives credence, it gives legitimacy to this paradigm, which lacks any evidence. So just out of curiosity, has anyone read the BPS's Power Threat Meaning Framework publication? Anyone read this? No one? All right, after this talk is finished, go online, download this, it's free. Yes, I'll give you the link. Basically, in my view, the BPS has really been leading the way in terms of moving past this psychiatric diagnosis paradigm. And in 2013, they published an official statement that said we should abandon these categories, these labels. And this publication just arrived in January, and it's really their attempt to provide an alternative way of thinking about psychological distress and behaviors that are deemed to be abnormal. So in summary, the authors describe the framework as a meta-framework based on the core assumption that emotional distress and troubling behavior are intelligible responses to social and relational adversities and their cultural and ideological meanings. So for the people in this room, the family therapists, systemic orientated, you should be very interested to realize it's very focused on context. But it's very dense, so take your time reading it. It's quite long. Anyway, this is what we have now. Psychotherapy on one side, dealing with psychological issues, neurology, dealing with the nervous system. And psychiatry floats in this limbo between these two and treats pseudo-illnesses. Now, when I say pseudo-illnesses, I'm not saying that people that go to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist for help. I'm not saying that they're just making it up, that they're faking it, that I completely acknowledge that some people hear voices, they feel paranoid, they experience immense sadness, despair, all these things are real experiences and behaviors. But to label them an illness is just nonsense. So I would argue that we need a simplification of mental health profession and that there's no longer a need for this profession. I think neurologists and psychotherapists can cooperate together. If a psychotherapist suspects that a medical problem exists, then they can refer them to a neurologist. If no issue of the nervous system is found, then the psychotherapist can help them. But if a neurological problem is found, there's no need for a psychiatrist. They'll just go to see the neurologist who actually treat issues in the nervous system. If you are a psychiatrist, I'm not saying you should just quit tomorrow. But I'm hoping that it's not going to take another generation to move on and abandon this paradigm, because it's often said that science advances one funeral at a time. I'm hoping it's not going to take another generation, and I'm optimistic based on the report from the United Nations and the BPS's report as well that we can move past this. There's a lot of other systemic issues that maintain this kind of medical paradigm, especially in the US, with how medical care is funded, and that's sort of outside my area of expertise, but it is an issue. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting. My name's Jonathan. Thank you very much for your attention. Those are my references. If there are any questions, feel free. Questions? I'm just going to assume that my talk was perfect and I answered everything in your minds. Yes.
Jonathan,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you for a very passionate pretty biased lecture.
Okay, where's my bias? Please tell me.
Oh, there's lots of bias there. You're
Okay.
quoting people who we know about. Lucy Johnson, it does not represent the BPS. Very clearly does not represent the BPS.
So why did she publish a report published by the BPS?
The BPS, like family therapy, holds lots of different schools. It's a broad church, yeah?
Okay. But what's the actual inaccuracy you're pointing to?
Selectivity. Yeah? Okay?
Okay, so what did I miss? Can you share?
Are there any psychiatrists in the room that want to say anything?
Yes?
I think my question is specifically, what are the implications for mental health practitioners as it relates to expanding on our role? What I think about is this idea of context, and one of the things that jumped out at me just thinking about this is not just the context of individuals who are more likely to be labeled, but also how it is that we as clinicians have a responsibility to bring that up. And to sort of, as part of sort of what you're also talking about, sort of this idea of being aware of how we use language and bump language. And I guess I'm curious what you see as sort of an expansion of our role as part of this. Not just challenging psychiatry and pushing back, but also how we can raise our own voice.
Yeah, I think this time is a great opportunity, I think, for psychotherapists to reassert their importance and the efficacy of their treatments. Sorry if they were treatment, but I think both psychiatry and psychotherapy have done a really poor job of marketing what they do. Like, I think if you ask most people, what's the difference, or what do they even do? Most people, if you ask 10 people, they'll probably give you 10 different answers. So I think a greater understanding is necessary, but there's just so much misinformation going around, and like I said, it is very difficult to compete with Big Pharma's marketing machine. But as I said, just on a personal level, you can challenge people, you can refuse to use this kind of language, and spread the information. I mean, again, like, I don't have a grand solution for how to deal with the systemic issues and all the special interests in the pharmaceutical industry and the collusion between psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. That's a massive undertaking that I really don't have a strong solution for that. Yes?
I work in psychiatry, I'm not a psychiatrist, but we also agree that a lot of people are overdiagnosed and a lot of people get pathologised, and I don't think that's right. But, you know, and I have to disagree with you that medications don't help people. I've seen thousands of people get better on antidepressants, on...
Sure. I didn't say they don't do anything. I mean...
You said it's not a real illness, and all the medications are...
Yeah, they're not... The reason people get better is not necessarily because they're correcting a supposed deficiency. It's likely the placebo effect. And the way they...
Sorry.
Yes?
Placebo effects only work in the short term. They never work in the long term.
Yeah, and a lot of people on these drugs quit them after a long time, after not long, because of the side effects. So severe.
I disagree.
Okay. Yes?
I just have one comment. I'm not a medical doctor, so I cannot, I'm in scope. So, however, I've been to the doctor enough, and I've been with patients with comorbid and co-occurring disorders that have actual physical difficulties. And in the medical field, in general, is what you're describing. They don't always do blood tests or scans, and I've seen many people with psychiatric disorders do brain scans and see different parts of the brain that are firing off or whatever, but that's another story. But medical doctors in general look at symptoms and diagnose different types of diseases medically and prescribe medications for that, not psychiatrists. So in general, what I've seen just in my entire life of working with actual doctors and primary care physicians and neurologists and internists, and that's the general practice of a medical doctor. So what you're saying is exactly what other doctors are doing without maybe some other tests, unless they look deeper. I'm just making a comment.
Okay, I'm not sure if there's a question, but yeah, thanks.
There wasn't a question. It was just
Okay. Yes?
Oh, I just wanted to I wonder whether you're saying that psychiatry shouldn't exist or that they're being trained incorrectly. I certainly know in Australia there are many psychiatrists who don't prescribe drugs. They do actually psychotherapy. And so just to throw the whole, is it really throwing out the term psychiatry, or do you actually want psychiatrists to be trained differently so that they actually...
You know, for me, I draw a sharp line between psychotherapy and psychiatry because, and some of them, and my most respected authors like Peter Breggin or Thomas Zaz, I mean, they describe themselves psychiatrists, but I don't really consider them psychiatrists because they don't really prescribe, and they're basically trying to debunk their own profession. So yeah, psychiatry a long time ago, it was more focused on therapy, but now, to me, I view psychiatry as an ideology. It's basically based on the assumption that of this disease model. And so I draw a sharp line between psychotherapy and psychiatrists. I don't want to be labeled as a psychiatrist. And so
people don't draw that sharp line.
Yeah, and I think that's something, again, regarding language. For me, I distinguish the two. And again, like a lot of people, they don't really understand the difference. But for me, psychiatrists are focused on the brain and drugs, whereas psychotherapists focus on natural context. Yeah.
So it's only half.
Sorry?
It's only half. A lot of psychiatrists do psychotherapy as well.
Well, as I mentioned, it's been declining, and in 2005 it was like 1 in 10.
Most psychiatrists will, if they don't practice it themselves, will recommend that people get some therapy as well. You know, so it doesn't.
So yeah, so that's not their role then.
Sorry?
So it's not their role to do.
No, it can be their role, but some choose to do that, some choose not.
Yeah.
Pretty much the same as an orthopedic surgeon isn't going to do all the rehab for someone; they're going to pass it on to someone else.
Right. I mean, they did more in the past though. There's actually an interesting book, Unhinged, by Daniel Carlett, and he talks about how he argues that psychiatrists have sort of just followed the money in that they can make a lot more by just doing a 10, 20-minute consultation and then prescribing a pill rather than sitting down for an hour with one person. So that's a big part of it as well. Yes?
I just want to make a comment, not a question. I get where you're coming from, and a lot of it I think has a lot of that, and I agree with it. My personal point, because I see there's a bit of a power struggle also, and I see the danger in that, and that's my comment, is that I think just from my perspective, I agree with a lot, like I said. But if we look at psychotherapy, there's also a lot of research showing how ineffective psychotherapy is. So I think we should really sweep in front of our own door. Yesterday,
I agree.
Dr. Warwick Phipps had a presentation where he actually quoted research that's showing that how ineffective couples therapy is, and that a lot of people divorce after couples therapy, and the statistics shows.
Well, that's not necessarily, I don't know if that's necessarily failure, but you know, a divorce doesn't...
That's what's getting out there is the stigma against psychotherapy, and
right,
it's also not breaking down the stigma in society that psychotherapy works, because people read these things, and obviously people don't always, the general public don't understand scientific research. They just see quotes, and it's like psychotherapy is not working, divorce rates increasing after psychotherapy, because it's a comparative study. It showed that some people that didn't receive couples therapy or marital therapy stayed together, and people that received a divorce. So, you know, I think that's really, I think the point is actually the whole mental health field should actually get together instead of having debate, actually enter into dialogue and say, listen, we have to get together. What we are doing is not actually working.
Well, if I try to imply that psychotherapy is like the one-size-fits-all solution, that was not my intention at all. Psychotherapy works for some people, but not for everyone, and there are many other alternatives. Johan Hari just published a new book called Lost Connections, in which he talks about a lot of other solutions, not just psychotherapy, that can benefit people. And yeah, culturally, there's a lot of other factors involved in people's state of health, mental health. And so yeah, I'm not trying to claim that psychiatry is the solution for everyone at all. Yeah. Any more? Yes?
Maybe just a comment. I think your presentation would have a slightly more positive effect in an Asian context, because psychiatry in Asia tend to be 2,000 patients in one day. You know, a psychiatrist see the person just for a few minutes.
Right.
It's good money for the hospital, and and there's a lot of implicit trust in the psychiatrist, even though it's only 2 minutes. But I think what it says, overall, I think is all professions, whether it's psychiatrists, therapists, and everything, it's the heart that they put into the work, and that would guide them properly, and also collaborative work. I think that's the one we need to.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
I think that if you put all the meta-analysis of the drug and the placebo into your presentation, it will help you to validate what you talk about more.
Okay, yes, I mean, there's many reviews been done. Irving Kirsch probably most famously, he did a number of studies looking at these drugs. And there's so much manipulation that goes on, like I said, in terms of the drug companies just hide information and obscure the data. But the studies that show that they're effective, like the way they actually define depression, it's on this completely subjective scale, and actually the actual effectiveness, it's actually clinically insignificant, meaning that clinicians can't actually discern a difference, even though it's a difference on the scale. They can't actually discern a difference in reality. That's one other thing I was going to say. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.